Hello, and welcome to Tell Me Fear, where every story chills you to the bone. Are you ready to face what's hiding in the dark? Before we begin, I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know just how far the fear is reaching. Just over a year ago, I moved into an old house in an isolated neighborhood. I needed a place where I could work in peace, far from the noise of the city. The house was big, beautiful, but with a worn look. I didn't care about its condition. In fact, the price was so low it seemed like an unmissable opportunity. From the start, something about that house gave me a strange feeling, as if I'd crossed some kind of invisible barrier by stepping inside. But I ignored it. For the first week, the nights were completely silent. On one hand, it was exactly what I wanted, but on the other, there was an uncomfortable emptiness, as if the house absorbed all sounds and swallowed them. One night, while exploring the upstairs rooms, I noticed something unusual. One of the rooms was locked, and I couldn't find the key anywhere. I stood staring at the door for a while, intrigued, but convinced myself it was just a storage room, perhaps abandoned by the previous owner. Days later, as I was walking through the house at night, I heard a muffled sound coming from that room. I froze, listening more closely. It was like a soft murmur, quiet enough to make me doubt I'd heard anything at all. I moved closer to the door, pressed my ear against it, but the silence was even heavier there. Whatever sound had been there was gone. No matter how I tried to follow my usual routine, that locked room started to bother me. In the following nights, I started to hear more strange sounds around the house, like soft footsteps on the upper floor, always coming from the same spot. And these weren't old house creaks, they were real footsteps, clear enough that I could picture a person walking through the upstairs hallway. But whenever I went up to check, I found nothing. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I spent an entire afternoon looking for the key to that room. I went through all the drawers, inspected every corner, and found nothing. I started to think about forcing the door open, but at the same time, I hesitated. For some reason, I felt I should leave that room alone. A few days later, I had an unexpected visitor. It was an older woman who looked around 70, with deep-set eyes and a tired expression. She asked if she could come inside to look at the house, saying she had lived there with her family many years ago. I found it strange, but I let her in. As she walked through the rooms, I noticed her expression darkening, almost as if something about the place disturbed her. When she reached the second floor, her demeanor changed further when she approached the locked room. She asked, in a trembling voice, if I had gone in there. I explained that I didn't have the key but often heard strange noises coming from inside. She stared at me for a long moment and then said something that chilled me to the bone. There are things that shouldn't be disturbed, especially in a house like this. I asked what she meant, but she only shook her head and left, saying nothing more. I had a strong sense she knew more than she wanted to say. After that visit, things got worse. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and I began to feel as though I wasn't alone in the house. I started seeing shadows everywhere, especially when I went upstairs at night. More than once, while walking through the hallway, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing next to the locked door. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I couldn't sleep properly, spending hours each night sitting up in bed, trying to understand what was happening. One sleepless night, I decided I had to open that room once and for all. I grabbed some tools and, with difficulty, managed to force the lock open. When I finally entered, a wave of coldness washed over me, so freezing that my breath turned into mist. The room was dark and dusty, but when I turned on my flashlight, the sight in front of me made my skin crawl. In the center of the room was a small bed and an old chest. On the bed lay a dusty doll, and the musty smell was overwhelming. As I looked around, I saw old photos, portraits of a child who seemed to have lived there. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the room seemed like it had been abandoned in a hurry, as if someone had just walked away and left everything behind. I opened the chest and found a diary. The pages were yellowed, and the handwriting shaky, almost childlike. As I read, I realized the child had written about a dark figure that appeared in her room at night, whispering her name. She described this figure hiding in the shadows, seeming to grow bigger each night, becoming more and more menacing. In the final entries, the child mentioned that the presence was now with her all the time. I shut the diary quickly, feeling a deep sense of dread. That same night, while trying to sleep, I heard heavy breathing right beside my bed. I turned, but there was no one there. However, the air was icy, just like in the child's room. The sense of being watched was so intense that I started sweating, despite the cold. The following nights were nothing short of a nightmare. I felt the presence drawing nearer, as though something was stalking me. The constant feeling of dread and fear consumed me. I began to question my own sanity. One night, I decided I had to leave the house, but when I tried to open the front door, I felt an invisible force pushing back. It was as if something had decided to keep me there. In a final act of desperation, I turned on every light in the house and burned the diary. As the flames consumed the pages, I felt the atmosphere lighten, as if something had finally let go. However, I still feel like a part of me remains in that house. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the shadow watching, waiting. Since I can remember, I've always had a fascination with horror stories. I grew up in a small town where whispers and urban legends were common among the locals, but I never thought I would become part of such a tale. Like everyone else, I always believed that terrible things happen only to other people, until my life took an unexpected turn. It all began on a stormy night when I was home alone. The storm outside was intense, and the flickering lights only heightened my anxiety. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through social media, when a post caught my eye. It was a private message from an anonymous account, featuring a photo of my backyard. The message read, "You are being watched." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. My first reaction was disbelief. I looked out the window, but nothing seemed out of place. How could someone know I was home alone? I tried to push the thought aside and went back to my phone, but the message kept echoing in my mind. When I glanced back at the photo, I realized it clearly showed the back door, which was ajar. The feeling that someone was watching me intensified. Heart racing, I got up and went to the door, closing it tightly. I tried to shake off the fear, thinking it could be a cruel joke. However, as I returned to the couch, I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. It was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart race again. I decided it was time to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight I found on the coffee table. Each step felt like an echo in the darkness. When I reached the hallway, I noticed that all the bedroom doors were closed. With the flashlight in hand, I began to open them one by one, but found nothing. The house was silent, except for the sound of the rain. With adrenaline still pumping, I returned to the living room, determined to ignore the message and try to relax. I put on a horror movie to distract myself. However, as the night wore on, I felt a presence, as if someone were in the house with me. The sound of the rain seemed to grow louder, and each clap of thunder made my heart race even faster. After a few hours, I decided it was too late and that I needed to sleep. I went to my room, but as I lay down, I couldn't relax. The feeling of being watched returned, and the thought that someone might be hiding in the house left me uneasy. I closed my eyes and tried to calm down, but every creak of the house made me jump. When I finally managed to fall asleep, I was jolted awake by a loud noise. I shot up and looked around, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. The noise seemed to be coming from the living room, and my first instinct was to check my phone for messages. To my surprise, there was another message from the same anonymous account. It read, "I'm closer than you think." At that moment, Panic surged through me. I knew I couldn't stay there. With the flashlight in hand, I decided to face whatever was in the living room. As I walked, each step felt heavier than the last. The living room was dark, and the flashlight barely illuminated the space. When I entered, everything appeared to be in order, but a strange odor hung in the air, something akin to mildew. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and it was then that I noticed something on the wall. There were scratch marks, as if someone had tried to force the door open. My hands began to tremble, and I realized I was not alone. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and I couldn't contain the scream that escaped my lips. The shadow vanished instantly, but I knew it wasn't a hallucination. I bolted back to my room, barricading the door with a chair. My breath was ragged, and the fear seemed to consume me. I tried calling the police, but my phone had no signal. The silence in the house was deafening, and the only sound I could hear was my heart pounding. As the rain started to die down, my mind was in a state of total panic. The thought that someone was in the house with me made me feel increasingly vulnerable. I decided I needed to escape. Cautiously, I grabbed my backpack and packed some essentials like my laptop and a few clothes. When I prepared to leave, I noticed that the front door was ajar. My heart raced again. I remembered the message I received, and the feeling that someone was playing a cat and mouse game with me filled me with dread. I looked out the window, and to my shock, I saw a hooded figure standing in front of my house. It looked as if it were waiting for me. The figure remained still, just watching. Panic surged through me, and I knew I needed to act quickly. I headed for the back door, which had always been the safer exit, but to my surprise, it was locked. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I turned back to look out the window, and the figure was now at the front door, banging loudly. With each knock, I could feel the floor tremble beneath me. The light from my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging everything into darkness again. It felt like the house was holding its breath, but I knew I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I took a deep breath and realized that my only option was to confront the situation. I decided to open the front door. The figure stood there, waiting. With the knife in one hand and the door partially open in the other, I faced the unknown. When the door finally creaked open, what I saw left me in shock. The figure was hooded, but it wasn't a stranger. It was an old friend from school who had disappeared years ago. Her face was pale, and her eyes were vacant, as if she were lost in a nightmare. She looked at me and said, "You shouldn't be here." Confused, I asked what was happening. She whispered something about occult and macabre rituals happening in the shadows of the town. As she spoke, I realized that something was very wrong. She no longer seemed like the person I knew. A chill crept through the room, and I could feel despair beginning to rise within me. Before I could react, the figure began to move closer, and in that moment, I understood that I wasn't just dealing with a simple reunion, but with something much more terrifying. I ran back, but the front door slammed shut behind me as if an invisible force was working against me. Panic heightened, and I knew I had to find a way to escape this situation. I remembered the flashlight and rushed to the kitchen, where I had seen a heavy object that could help. I grabbed a pan and, with the knife still in my other hand, prepared to confront whatever was about to happen. Meanwhile, my old friend whispered incoherent words, and I could sense darkness surrounding us. The environment began to shift, and what was once a simple house transformed into a labyrinth of horrors. The walls seemed to close in, and I could hear whispers that weren't hers. It was as if I was being pulled into an abyss. With each step I took, the darkness became denser and more oppressive. I shouted at her, asking what had happened and why she was there. In response, she merely smiled, a hollow, disturbing smile. What I saw in her eyes was not my friend, but something much more sinister. I had to find a way out. The kitchen door was locked, but the window was open, and I decided that was my only chance. With a desperate leap, I jumped through the window, falling to the ground outside. The rain had stopped, but the night was still dark. As I got up, I looked back and saw the hooded figure watching me from the window. A scream echoed in the night, and I ran like I never had before. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put distance between myself and that house and the entity that had taken hold of my friend. Finally, I reached the street and spotted a car approaching. I waved frantically, and thankfully, the driver stopped. I quickly explained the situation, and he drove me far away from there. As we drove, I looked back and saw the house fading into the distance, but the feeling of relief didn't last. The experience left deep scars, and I was left with the certainty that darkness exists, not just in legends, but also among those we once knew. I never returned to that town. Some things, once seen, can never be forgotten. The memory of my friend and that horrific night will stay with me forever. When I look back, I can't comprehend how life can change so quickly. I never imagined I would experience something that would become a chilling tale told among friends. It all began on a rainy autumn night. I was at home, as usual, getting ready for yet another dull weekend. Leaves were falling from the trees, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, creating a melancholic atmosphere that matched my mood. Sometimes, solitude is the best companion, but that night, I wasn't so sure. As I settled onto the couch with a book, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. It was a creak, like something had fallen. I counted to 3, and even though my instinct told me to ignore it, curiosity compelled me to get up. The sound was becoming more frequent, so with a flashlight in hand, I slowly climbed the stairs, trying not to make a noise. With each step, my heart raced faster. Once I reached the hallway, I realized the noise was coming from my brother's room. He wasn't home, he had gone to a party. I pushed the door open, but there was no one inside. Shadows danced on the walls as the flashlight illuminated familiar objects. I looked around, and just as I was about to walk away, I heard a whisper. A soft sound, as if someone was trying to call me. The feeling that I wasn't alone enveloped me, sending chills down my spine. I was drawn to the sound, which seemed to be coming from the closet. With trembling courage, I approached and opened the door. The closet was empty, except for some clothes hanging and a shoe that didn't belong to anyone in the family. When I saw the shoe, a cold panic spread through my body. It wasn't my brother's, and suddenly, my mind began conjuring dark scenarios. The thought that someone might have entered our house consumed me, and I decided it was time to leave. Just as I was about to step back, I heard a noise again, this time louder, as if something had been thrown to the floor. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. My heart raced as I hurried down the stairs, planning to lock all the doors and windows. As I reached the ground floor, the phone rang, causing me to jump. The number on the screen was unknown, but in a moment of impulse, I answered. On the other end, a low, trembling voice said, "You need to get out of the house." Before I could respond, the call dropped. Adrenaline took over, and I began searching for exits. I glanced out the living room window and noticed the street was deserted. The only sounds I could hear were the wind and the rain. While locking the front door, an odd sensation made me look back. The hallway was dark, and in the distance, I saw a shadow moving quickly. My survival instinct screamed, and in a desperate act, I grabbed my car keys and rushed to the garage. As I exited through the back door, panic consumed me. My hands shook as I struggled to unlock the car. Finally, I managed to get inside and start the engine. Just as I turned the key, I heard rapid footsteps approaching the house. My heart felt like it would explode. I glanced back and saw a figure in the doorway, a vague silhouette, but the presence was undeniable. Without looking back, I floored the gas and drove away from my home. I drove for hours, aimlessly, trying to distance myself from that horrible feeling. With every turn, the image of that shadow became clearer in my mind. I decided to stop at a diner on the side of the road, a small, dimly lit place. As soon as I entered, the smell of coffee and home-cooked food calmed me a bit. I ordered a coffee and sat in the back, trying to think about everything that had happened. While I was trying to collect my thoughts, I overheard two women at the next table talking. They were discussing a crime that had occurred back in my town, a series of disappearances that had shaken the community. My heart stopped. One of the women described the last time someone was seen, and what unsettled me the most was when she mentioned that the last victim had been seen on my street. When the woman finished her story, I couldn't help myself and approached their table, asking for details. They talked about a man who had been spotted watching one of the victims' houses before disappearing. My heart sank when I realized that this house was mine. I had no idea if I should return, but the thought that someone might still be there haunted me. As the women continued to talk, the diner's doorbell rang, and a wave of cold washed over me. A man entered, and his presence was unmistakable, causing everyone in the diner to go silent. He looked like a shadow, wearing a dark coat and partially covering his face. His eyes locked onto mine for a brief moment before he moved toward a corner. Fear gripped me, and my instinct screamed for me to leave. As soon as I paid my bill, I rushed out and jumped into my car. The man hadn't followed me, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I drove longer, trying to put distance between myself and that threatening presence. When I finally reached a different town, I started to feel a bit safer. However, the sensation of being followed never left me. With each corner I turned, with each new face I saw, I looked at them with suspicion. I pulled into a cheap motel, asking for a room in the back. As soon as I entered, I locked all the curtains and secured the door. My eyes were heavy, but fear kept me alert. I decided I needed to distract my mind, so I turned on the TV. Yet, with every noise, I jumped up to check the windows. I spent an entire night in that state of constant anxiety, unable to close my eyes. Just when I thought I could finally rest, I was jolted awake by a noise at the door. My heart stopped. I looked at the clock and saw it was nearly midnight. The knocking was soft, almost like a whisper. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and called the front desk, but there was no answer. The knocking continued, and with every rap, my fear mounted. Finally, I took a deep breath, grabbed my key, and headed to the door. Upon opening it, I found no one there. The hallway was empty. A mix of relief and confusion washed over me. I returned to the room, but I couldn't relax. The image of the shadow in my house felt more real than ever. I decided it was time to go back and confront whatever was tormenting me. At dawn, I packed my things and drove back home, determined to discover the truth. When I arrived, everything appeared normal, but the sense that something was off was palpable. I walked in and began searching every corner of the house. As I moved down the hallway, the lights flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. In the next moment, I saw the shadow again, but this time it seemed more defined, as if it were approaching me. I screamed and bolted to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The only sound I could hear was her heavy breathing outside. I knew I needed to escape. I glanced around and saw a window. That was my only chance. With tremendous effort, I managed to open the window and jumped, landing in a pile of leaves. The pain was immediate, but I didn't have time to think about it. I got up and ran toward the street. When I got there, I saw no one else around. The house stood as a monument of solitude. Looking back, I saw the woman in the window, staring at me with that horrifying smile. I didn't stop to think. I raced to the car, and as soon as I got in, I started the engine. The car hesitated for a moment, but finally, it roared to life. As I sped away from the garage, I glanced back, and the woman was still there, now accompanied by other shadowy figures. Fear consumed me, and I hit the gas, leaving my home and everything in it behind. I never returned. What happened that night haunts me to this day. The memories of the shadow and the figures in the window refuse to leave me alone. I feel as though I'm being watched, and even now, when I'm surrounded by friends and family, that sensation that something is observing me never fades. People may think stories like this are just horror tales, but the truth is, they can become a reality in ways you never imagined. I never imagined something like this could happen to me. I've always been a rational person who believed that horror stories were just that, stories. That was until that night. It all started on a normal Tuesday, a cold and rainy evening, when I was home alone. My family had gone away for an event, and for some reason, the house felt quieter than usual. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows and the wind howling outside were the only noises breaking the otherwise eerie silence. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, trying to distract myself. Everything seemed normal, almost mundane, and I began to relax. But soon, I heard a sound I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a tree branch scraping against the window, but it repeated, becoming clearer. It sounded like a door creaking. Not just any door, but something heavy being dragged across the floor, as if someone was moving slowly through the house. I glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The house was quiet. I got up from the couch, walked to the window, and peered outside. The street was empty. The rain fell heavily, and the street lights flickered occasionally from the strength of the wind. I went back to the couch, trying to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind. Maybe it was nothing. I was alone, and the house was large enough to make every creak sound amplified. But something didn't feel right. The sound continued, now louder and clearer, coming from upstairs. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. I knew that much. My heart began to race, and the uneasy feeling grew stronger. What was it? It couldn't be anyone. It wasn't possible. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an air draft. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to investigate, even though everything in me screamed not to. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly made my way down the hallway. Each step I took made the floorboards creak under my weight, breaking the silence of the house. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, the sound had gotten louder. It was coming directly from my bedroom. I didn't know what to expect, but something told me to move cautiously. My body tensed, but fear and curiosity drove me forward. I opened my bedroom door slowly, trying not to make a sound. Everything looked normal. The room was empty, except for a slightly open window. The curtains swayed softly with the wind. But the sound kept going, louder now, and it seemed to be coming from the closet. The feeling that I wasn't alone in the room was overwhelming. With my heart pounding, I approached the closet. It was as though something, or someone, was calling me from inside. Every step made my stomach twist with dread. I opened the closet door and, to my relief, there was no one there. Just clothes hanging on hangers and a pile of shoes on the floor. But something was off. In the bottom left corner of the closet, I noticed a small box that I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. Something told me that box shouldn't be there. I bent down to pick it up, and it was warm, almost as if it had been handled recently. But when I opened it, there was nothing inside except a folded piece of paper. The paper was old, crumpled, but mostly intact. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The words written on the paper were simple but chilling. "I'm here, waiting for you." Those words froze me in place. It couldn't be real. I looked around the room, feeling more and more watched with each passing second. I quickly shoved the paper back into the box and closed it, then hastily placed it back where it was. I rushed to leave the room, but as I reached the door, I heard it again, a sound, but this time, it was coming from the bathroom. I had no idea what was happening anymore, but one thing was clear, I was no longer alone. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but something held me back, like an invisible force was keeping me there. I was trapped. I took a deep breath and, with all the courage I could muster, I walked toward the bathroom door. The light was off, but as I peered through the crack in the door, I saw something that made me nearly lose my breath. In the dark, I could make out the shape of a figure standing still. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. My body screamed for me to shut the door, to run, but I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the door open slowly, and as the light flicked on, the figure disappeared. But the air in the room felt dense, heavy, suffocating. I looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The bathroom was empty. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on me. That's when I heard it, something behind me. Not a simple noise, but a slow, labored breathing, as though someone was standing right behind me, watching my every move. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing. Only my reflection in the mirror. I knew someone, or something, was behind me, but I couldn't see it. My body trembled with fear, and that's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The bathroom door was now locked. I was certain I had left it open. My mind was in chaos. I had to get out. The fear mixed with the overwhelming sensation of being watched, and I knew that something was lurking, waiting for me. I sprinted down the stairs, but the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. I was being followed. When I reached the front door, I found that it was locked. Something was off with the key, as if it had been turned from the outside. I was trapped. The breathing came closer, heavier now, suffocating me. I didn't know what else to do. I was completely cornered, and fear consumed me. I ran to the side of the house, trying to find another way out. But as I turned, I saw a figure in the living room window. It was standing there, staring at me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Without thinking, I ran to my car. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, but I had no choice. I jumped in, started the engine, but it hesitated for a moment before roaring to life. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped out of the garage, glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, watching from the window. But now, it wasn't alone. There were more figures, standing in the dark, all staring at me. I didn't know what to think anymore. The terror consumed me, and without hesitating, I slammed my foot on the accelerator, leaving the house, my life, everything behind. I never went back. What happened that night stayed with me, haunting me. I still don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but since that night, I've never felt safe. Even now, surrounded by people, I still feel that cold, distant gaze following me, waiting to find me again.